Hello and welcome back to the APUSH History Curriculum. We are continuing our look at the fourth time period covered in APUSH, which covers the year 1800 to 1848. In our last set of videos, that I call Unit 4 for the purposes of our class structure, we focused on the first half of the time period that was heavily influenced by Thomas Jefferson and his policies. In this half of the time period, we are looking at the presidency and influence of Andrew Jackson, as well as the social issues that arose in this half of the period. There are still overlapping key concepts, though, so make sure that you pay attention to the themes that carry over between the two. Just a quick look back at the key concepts for the era, which focus on the U.S. attempts to build a modern democracy and put into practice the forms of government they had created in the aftermath of the Revolution, and to adapt their society to those ideals. The key concepts also focus on the innovations that changed the American economy, which in turn spurred America's interest in foreign trade and led to dramatic changes in U.S. society, as well as the creation of both national and regional identities. Here in Unit 5, the topics we will look at include expanding democracy, Jackson and federal power, the development of an American culture, the Second Great Awakening, the reform movements of the early 19th century, and the role of African Americans in the early republic, along with the Society of the South. So in this video, we will be looking at how democracy expanded during this time period, especially in the latter half during the age of Jackson, and how you continue to have debates over the role that government was to play in American society. So let's get to it. The framers of the Constitution didn't specify who could vote and left that determination to the individual states, and they had generally limited voting rights to property owners. In a few cases, women and free blacks could vote, provided they could meet the property requirement, which was usually 50 acres of land, although a couple of states required 100. The reasoning for this qualification was because they felt property owners had a more vested interest in good government, since it wasn't as easy to just leave in the event that a government became tyrannical. But in the 1820s, there began to be a shift in attitudes about who could vote, as the U.S. essentially tried to adopt egalitarian principles, trying to uphold its idea that all men were created equal from the Declaration of Independence. Many of the newer states that had joined the Union had allowed all adult white males to vote, regardless of property ownership, and those in older states began to demand the same access. You really see this in the number of votes that are cast for president. In 1820, only about 108,000 votes were cast in that year's presidential election. In 1824, it had risen to about 350,000, and that's among 4 candidates. But by 1840, over 2.4 million people cast ballots, about 80% of the adult white male population. All of these new participants caused a realignment in the political parties. Remember, after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party had ceased to exist, leaving only the Democratic Republicans, ushering in the so-called era of good feelings, which was an era of one-party politics. But that era was relatively short-lived. The Panic of 1819 and the Supreme Court decision in McCulloch v. Maryland the same year had reignited the debate about federal power and state sovereignty. And then, intra-party rivalry, especially evident in the election of 1824, brought the era to an end and ushered in a new era of political competition. In that election, there were 4 candidates vying for the presidency: John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. Jackson won more popular and more electoral votes than anybody else. However, he did not have the electoral majority he needed. He needed 130 electoral votes, and he only had 99. Adams finished in second, Crawford in third, and Henry Clay in fourth. The House of Representatives would therefore decide the presidency. There wasn't actually a problem with the vice presidency because both Adams and Jackson had John C. Calhoun on their ticket, and so he easily won a majority of the electoral votes for vice president. The House, though, considered only the top 3 candidates, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford. But Crawford was unlikely to be chosen since he was recovering from a stroke. So Henry Clay was out, but as Speaker of the House of Representatives, he used his influence in Congress to get the votes for John Quincy Adams, because Henry Clay did not like Andrew Jackson. Later, after Adams was sworn into office, Henry Clay was appointed Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters claimed that this was a corrupt backroom deal and labeled it the corrupt bargain, because at the time, Secretary of State was the key position if you wanted to become President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams himself, the previous 4 presidents, had all served first as Secretary of State. In the aftermath of this election, the Democratic-Republican Party split, forming the Democratic Party and the National Republicans, ushering in the second party system, with 2 well-organized parties in opposition to each other. There were also minor parties that existed as well, and they introduced ideas that would gradually be embraced by the 2 main parties. For example, the Anti-Masonic Party would be the first to hold a party nominating convention, an event in which party members, and not just a small group of party leaders, would choose the candidates for office. This replaced the old caucus system, which was where a very few people chose who the candidate was going to be for the masses, but that was seen as undemocratic and elitist. And eventually the Democratic Party followed this idea of a nominating convention in 1832, and the Whig Party, which replaced the National Republicans, they followed as well in 1839. Well, that's what you need to know about the expansion of democracy in the first half of the 19th century. We'll look more closely at Andrew Jackson's presidency in the next video, and particularly his use of federal power. Until next time.